We'll open your Bibles back to Exodus chapter 3. Good to see everybody back tonight. Hope you had a great afternoon. Several of you were at Dyersburg Healthcare. We had a great service over there. Got to see some new faces from the residents, and it's always good to be with those folks. If you don't go often, or if you've never been, I would highly encourage you to, next time we're over there in 2 weeks on the that'll be the 28th, to try to do that. I promise you it will be worth your while. Let me mention a couple of other things real quick before we begin. Number one, young people, don't forget Summer Youth Series is tomorrow night at Alamo, and the bus will be leaving at 6:15. So if you plan on going with us to Summer Youth Series, be here by then. And let's wear the shirts we just got in, the ones we wore for Bible school. For those who don't go, we try to wear the same shirts every week. So we try to coordinate that as much as we can, if I remember to anyway. So we'll wear our new shirts tomorrow night, if you have one. So be here at 6:15 and we'll go and enjoy that time together. By the way, our week to host this summer is June the 29th. Which is, that's 2 weeks from tomorrow night. So our week is rapidly approaching, and if you have not been the last couple of years that we've hosted, you really, I'm saying this to do you a favor, you really need to plan on being here. It is some of the most encouraging, Monday nights during the summer are some of the most encouraging nights of the year. Seeing the number of young people that show up and willingly, not, they're not handcuffed and drug into church buses and brought here against their will. These are young people who are excited and enthusiastic about coming to these devotionals. And you can really tell, particularly during the singing, which is to me always the greatest part. And with the acoustics we have here, the singing we've had the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, however long we've been doing it, has just been outstanding. And I've heard multiple comments from folks who have been here who aren't necessarily used to being around youth-oriented events like that have just sung the praises of the singing. You need to plan on being here. I'm telling you, June the 29th, we'll host it here at Phillip Street. We'd love to have you come to any of them during the summer, but particularly make it a priority to be here June 29th, and you will not be disappointed. I know there's some plans in the works about the meal we're going to have after services that night. We'll be getting that announced maybe within the course of this week. I'm not sure of all the absolute final arrangement plans. But I know we'll be getting word to you about what our plans are, and that way we can prepare accordingly. And also for all those who have brought in drinks for camp or have given me money, thank you so much. We still have a ways to go. If we fill up this year, as I'm anticipating, we're going to go through in excess of 1,500 drinks during the week. That's 100 people being present 3 times a day for 5 days. So they add up very, very quickly. And we've got some money and we have a few drinks already. But we still have a long ways to go from being where I need to be to keep that from eating too much into my regular working budget. And you've done so much. I really hate to ask, but you've done so well helping me keep costs down during camp for that. And it's just been a tremendous blessing. And any help you can provide in that, again, we would appreciate. If you don't want to fool with drinks, I completely understand. And if you'd just like to make a donation, you can give that to me. And the week before camp, I'll go whatever extra we need in drinks that have not been turned in. Seemed like there might have been one other thing I was supposed to mention, but I don't remember what it is, so we'll just move on. This morning we began a new series that I said was going to go through the summer, encompassing the months of June and July, that are going to revolve around the concept you see on the board before us A statement that God first originated back in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14 when He had gone to Moses after Moses had been out of the land of Egypt for 40 years. And you remember that God presented Himself to Moses in the midst of that burning bush. And Moses came to pursue exactly what it was happening with that bush, and God began to speak to him and said, "Moses, I want you to go back in and bring my people out." And we talked about how that Moses was a little less than enthusiastic about the prospects of going back into the land of Egypt from which he had escaped for his own life 40 years prior to that time. And yet he knew the mission was one that was so worthy to bring his brethren in the flesh out, and as God had promised, unto a land that was flowing with milk and honey. But because Moses was less than enthusiastic about that, and he was a little insecure about the capability he had to be a leader to such a vast number of people in such a vital effort, he expressed those insecurities to God. The second of which you remember was, Moses said, I believe it was Exodus 3 and verse 8, "When I go in and I tell the people that God has sent me in to deliver you out, and they ask me, well, what is the name of this God that you claim has directed you to engage in these actions?" He said, "I am that I am." And you just tell those folks that the I am sent you to them. And that's exactly what Moses did. And we talked about how those two little simple words encompass so many realities that we need to know about God, not just in the Old Testament, but in the book of John. You remember that Jesus used those same two words no less than 8 different times in expressing Himself, His identity, the role He was going to play in this world and beyond, to His disciples. And through this summer, we're going to look at those I am statements that Jesus made through the book of John, but I wanted to use today as a foundation, as a launching board, to provide us a little background information of what exactly is encompassed in those two little words that God used to identify Himself, to liken Himself to certain things, but to do so much more than that. And we mentioned this morning that among no doubt many other things that we just don't have time to talk about, that God was trying to express at least 3 different realities to them and to us that we need to know before we begin looking at those I am statements individually. And the one that we talked about this morning is that in those 2 words, inherent in those 2 words is the fact that God was expressing to them and to us His eternal presence. And we talked about how those 2 words grammatically are present tense, to illustrate how that God always has been, is now, and always will be in the present tense. Before the foundation of the world, back into the recesses of eternity, God could declare with all honesty and surety, I am. When time began, God could declare, I am. Throughout history, God could declare, I am. God can declare, I am. In the future, He can, and even unto everlasting. God can still claim, I am, because He always has been and He always will be. He is God from everlasting unto everlasting. Psalm 90 and verse 2. And when we see those 2 little words, whether it be in the outright expression of self-identity in Exodus chapter 3, or whether it be in those likening statements in the book of John, we see that God is demonstrating to all those who are hearing, all those who are reading, that He has an eternal presence. And there's something divine about that. Number 2 tonight as we begin, not only do we see that in those 2 little words God was expressing His eternal presence. I mentioned this morning how we were going to begin tonight by talking about in those 2 little words, God was at the same time expressing what I'm calling an embodiment principle. And what I mean by an embodiment principle is I'm saying that God is expressing the concept that He embodies the essence of whatever quality is attributed to Him. Think about some realities that practically every avowed Christian just simply accepts about God. He is perfect. He is supreme. He is infallible. And is it not the case that if He is perfect and supreme and infallible in any area, that He's perfect and supreme and infallible in every area, including every quality that is attributed to Him? That is, whatever He is, no one or even God Himself could be it, whatever it is, more so than He is. Now, if that sounded confusing, I apologize, but let me give you some examples of what I mean. Number one, when we think about God and some inherent attributes that the Bible clearly discusses apply to God, we think about God in terms of God being a God of wisdom, right? But you know, it's not that God is just wise like we may think of other people in this world as being wise. Do you know anybody in your life that if you were to think of that person, or if I were to ask you, do you know someone who is wise, you'd think, well, yeah, you know, oh, so-and-so over here, or Mr. So-and-so, or Miss So-and-so. To me, that's always been a wise person. We can have a degree of wisdom, but we're not talking about God being a God of wisdom in the same way that we could talk about one another as being people of wisdom. No, when we say that God is a God of wisdom, we're not just talking about Him being knowledgeable, we're talking about Him having all knowledge, right? Job chapter 37 and verse 16, it said of God that He is perfect in knowledge. In other words, when we're speaking of God as a God of wisdom, God embodies wisdom. Or when we're talking about God being a God of knowledge, we're talking about how that God embodies knowledge. God knows, and God can't know any more than He already knows. God's not going to learn anything new. That's what I mean by saying He embodies wisdom and knowledge. Number two, we think about God in terms of He being a God of power. But not in the same way that we think of one another as having power, whether it be physical or social or corporate or anything of that nature. I mean, men and women today can have power in many different respects. But that power is limited, isn't it? No, when we're talking about God being a God of power, He's not just powerful, He has all power, right? In Job 42 and verse 2, in Job's final declaration to God, as he's humbled himself and come to the reality of who God is and the role that He had played in everything that Job had just experienced in the last 41 chapters, Job said this of God, I know that Thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of Thine can be restrained. In other words, Job said, God, I know that You can do absolutely anything. You are all powerful. And so when we say that God is a God of power, we're talking about how God embodies the concept of power. He cannot get any more powerful than He is now, and any more powerful than He always has been. Number three, we think about God in terms of being an unchanging, immutable God, but He's not just unchanging in the sense that He's stubborn. Do we know people in life who are just unwilling to change, even though it's blatant to everybody around them that they need to? Sometimes we use the word unchanging in a derogatory manner because somebody's just too hard-headed to accept the reality that they need to change. That's not what we're saying about God. God is unchanging, but not in a stubborn, hard-headed sense. God is unchanging because He has no need for change. How could God improve on perfection? If God is perfect, then He has no need of change. Malachi 3 and verse 6, God Himself declared, I am the Lord, and I change not. And so when we talk about God in terms of Him being immutable, He embodies the concept of perfection. He has no room for improvement. When you think about perfection, you think about God, and that's what we mean by embodying that principle. Number 4, we think about God as being a holy God, but not in the same sense that we can be holy. See, we can be a holy people, but not inherently, right? I cannot be holy in and of myself. I'm not going to be holy just because I'm Andy. And neither are you going to be holy just because of who you are. We can be holy, but our holiness is reliant on someone else, right? Our holiness is reliant on our connection to God, who Himself is holy. But that's not the same with God. God is inherently holy. Psalm 99 and verse 9, the psalmist said, the Lord our God is holy. In and of Himself, without any reliance on anyone else or anything else for that holiness. And so we would say, because God is in and of Himself holy, that He embodies holiness. Or number 5, we think about God as being a righteous God. But again, not in the same sense that we can be righteous, because just like our holiness, our righteousness is reliant upon our connection to God. Not so with God. God is righteous, but He is inherently righteous. He is righteous in and of Himself. He embodies the principle of righteousness because He is perfectly righteous. Psalm 116 verse 5, gracious is Jehovah and righteous. One more, and one that always is at the forefront of my mind when I think about principles that God embodies. We think about God, we think about Him in terms of He being love. Not just loving, but He being love. God is love, right? Everything about Him is love, and nothing He has ever said, nothing He has ever done has ever been said or done outside of anything but absolute, unadulterated, undying love. And of course we're reminded of John's words in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, when John simply came to the conclusion that God is love. He embodies love. He is perfect in His love. He didn't have to learn love from anyone. He has always been love. And there's so many more principles that we could talk about that God embodies in and of Himself, in which He is perfect. That's what I mean by an embodiment principle. He exemplifies whatever attribute, whatever quality is assigned to Him in every conceivable way. But suffice it to say that the Bible makes it clear whatever or whoever God claims to be, He is that in perfection. He embodies it. Now, with all that in mind, let's look through some of these I am statements in the book of John. Not too deeply, because we're going to discuss them in more depth over the next couple of months. But I want to illustrate what I mean when I say that inherent in those two little words, I am, He's expressing that same embodiment principle that we've just applied to all of those other areas we just discussed. All right, now let's look at some of those I am statements. First of all, in John 6, verse 51, Jesus said, I am the living bread, which came down out of heaven, and if any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. Is it not the case that in that passage, in that one little simple statement when Jesus said, I am the living bread, that He's claiming to embody the principle of life-giving? I am the living bread, and if any man eat of this bread, who He claimed to be, He said, that man shall live forever. He is the source of life. and therefore He embodies the principle of life-giving. Secondly, in John 8 and verse 12, Jesus said, again therefore rather, Jesus spake unto them, saying, I am the light of the world, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. We're familiar with the principle of shining one's light, right? Matthew chapter 5. 1 John chapter 1, walk in the light as He is in the light. Psalm 119, 105, Thy word, O Lord, is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. We're familiar with that principle of shining a light. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Does He embody that principle? Is He perfect according to that attribute that is assigned to Him? Absolutely. He shines as a beacon of light that could not shine any brighter. And therefore He embodies the principle of being a shining light unto the world. Number 3, in John 8:58, Jesus therefore said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Doesn't sound grammatically correct, does it? But there was a point He was making. That pre-existent to Abraham, He was. Why? Because He's God. In that passage, Jesus is citing His embodiment of the principle of pre-existence and claiming divinity for Himself, which aggravated the Jews to no end. That was one of the foremost reasons why they were so active in plotting against Him and trying to put Him to death. And yet He embodied that principle of pre-existence and claimed it for Himself. Number 4, in John 10 verse 9, He said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and go out, and shall find pasture. You think in that passage Jesus is demonstrating how He embodies that principle of a safe entrance. He is the door. That is the way and the only way by which we can enter into that which we should enter, which by the way is the church. He's embodying the principle of safe entrance. He and He alone is able to accomplish that. We can look to no other. John 10 verse 11, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. When you think about a shepherd, you think about someone who leads and guides and protects, even if it means sacrificing his own life to do his job. And of all those that we've seen, doesn't Jesus, as much as any of them, embody that principle of protection and guidance as our own personal shepherd? John 11:25, Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. And he that believeth on me, though he die, yet shall he live. Resurrection, regeneration, the opportunity that we have to come out of death and pass into life, whether it be spiritual death unto spiritual life, whether it be physical death unto resurrection and eternal life. Jesus embodied the principle of regeneration. Number 7, John 14:6, familiar to all of us. Jesus said unto them, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man cometh unto the Father but by me. Does Jesus provide us direction and guidance? Do we look to Him for direction and guidance? Yes, because He embodies the concept of direction and guidance. We could look to no other who would provide us greater direction and greater guidance than He who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then one more in John 15:1. I am the true vine. My Father is the husbandman. And from that verse on, what does Jesus try to demonstrate to His disciples with regard to the connection they were to have to He as the true vine, or to Him as the true vine, but nutrition And the reality that a branch that is separated from that true vine does what? It withers and it dies and it eventually is cast into the fire. But if we want to maintain spiritual health and receive the spiritual nutrition that we have to survive, then we need to stay connected to the vine. And so is it not the case in that passage that Jesus states His embodiment of the principle of spiritual nutrition? We can look to no other who will provide us greater nutrition to feed our souls than Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I guess really what I'm trying to say when I talk about how those two little words, I am, expresses an embodiment principle, is to exalt Him and to glorify Him as the one to whom we must turn above any and all others. Because nobody else can embody any of those things. It's not just that we don't, it's that we can't. No man or no woman throughout the history of the world has ever embodied any of those things that are absolutely necessary for our own spiritual health and salvation. Jesus alone does. And so when He says, I am any of those things, folks, we better accept it. We better take it to heart. Because He is identifying Himself as our only hope. Number 3, not only in Exodus 3 and throughout the book of John, when Jesus uses those two little words, I am, is He expressing His eternal presence. Not only is He expressing that embodiment principle, but finally, at least as to our discussion, there I know is more that could be said. Finally, as to our discussion, we see He was expressing His example of preeminence, or His preeminent example. Now, what I mean by that is it not true that actions speak louder than words? And is it not true that most people grasp what they see far more than what they hear? And if we're going to talk about a person who put themselves out there for the sake of demonstration, for the sake of being an example, then we could cite no greater example of one who lived his life as a living sermon than Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Sure, we can be examples to one another. I've had more examples of men and women in my life than I could possibly mention or even count. And I know that you have as well. We can be examples to one another. In fact, we're commanded to be examples to one another. The point I'm making, though, is that God serves as our preeminent example. He is our greatest example. There is no other whom we could exalt above Him. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21, Peter said of Christ, "For hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that ye should follow in His steps." Contextually, sure, he's talking about how that we should be willing to follow in the steps of Christ as He suffered for us. But is it not the case that is a universal reality, that whatever example that Christ has provided for us, we need to look at that example as supreme? Whether it be in His suffering, whether it be in His moral guidance, whether it be in His uprightness, whether it be in the way that He dealt with others, in any area of His life, He serves as our preeminent example. In anything He's ever done, in anything He's ever said, in any expectation He has ever given. Now, I think that would be evident from His embodiment principle that we just mentioned a moment ago, from the verses cited that indicate Jesus as our supreme example. But I want to go back to those 8 I am statements for just a minute, because in those I am statements we see that preeminent example before us in all of those areas that we just cited. For instance, in John 6 and verse 51, We talked about how Jesus spoke of He being the living bread. Do we have any responsibility personally in feeding those around? I'm not necessarily talking about physically, though we do have that responsibility. Matthew chapter 25. What I'm talking about, though, is it not the case that we have a responsibility personally to feed those around us spiritually? Well, we sure do. Now, sure, elders have been tasked with feeding the flock, Acts 20, verse 28. But in a very real sense, we all have that responsibility. I mean, the Word of God is spoken of in terms of being food. 1 Peter chapter 2, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the Word that ye may grow thereby. Hebrews chapter 5. For when such time ye ought to yourselves be teachers, ye still have need that someone teach you the first principles of the oracles of God. And in that same passage talks about the Word of God in terms of milk and meat. And if we're to be teachers of the Word, and the Word is spoken of in terms of food, do we have a responsibility to feed anybody? Oh, we sure do. Who can we learn from in providing us some guidance in how to feed and what to feed, the manner by which to feed? Well, Jesus is our supreme, preeminent example, as He was the living bread. In John 8 and verse 12, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Do we have any responsibility ourselves in being light? Well, of course we do. Matthew 5. Ye are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle, put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick for all to see. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. If you will walk in the light as He is in the light, you have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, His Son, cleanses you from all sin. Do we have responsibility to be light? Yes. From whom can we learn to be light? Don't you think we could look at Jesus, the light of the world, as our preeminent example in that? John 8 and verse 58, I say unto you that before Abraham was, I am. Now, we don't have a responsibility to be pre-existent, but do we have a responsibility to declare the pre-existence of God? We sure do. To whom could we look as an example of declaring the pre-existence of God? Well, Jesus as our preeminent example. John 10 and verse 9, I am the door. Do we have any responsibility in pointing those around us to a safe entrance? I think we do, and you do too, because the Bible teaches we do. But to whom can we look as an example of how to point people in the direction they need to go in order to gain the entrance that they need? Christ is our preeminent example. John 10 and verse 11, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. Do we have any responsibility in acting like a shepherd in many respects? Elders obviously do. They're called shepherds. But do we have any responsibilities that would apply to certain qualities of shepherds? Do we have any responsibility to protect those around us spiritually? Do we have any responsibility to lead those around us spiritually? Yes. To whom can we look as a supreme example? Christ, preeminent. John 11:25, I am the resurrection. What responsibility do we have in helping people around us gain a new life? Well, Philippians 2, Colossians 2, Paul talked about how that when we become Christians, we put off the old man of sin, we put him to death in a respect, and we're born again. New individuals. Born again unto righteousness, he said. Same principle you see back in Romans chapter 6. To whom can we look as an example to help us as we help those around us try to achieve that new life? Christ. John chapter 14 verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Do we have a responsibility in directing and guiding people around us? Yes. Christ, though, is our preeminent example in how we can do that. John 15:1, I am the true vine and my Father is the husbandman. Do I have any responsibility in connecting people to the Father? Helping them stay spiritually healthy and vital and fruit-bearing? Oh, I sure do. And Christ is our preeminent example in that as well. And so when you look at these last two realities together, yes, Jesus embodies all of those principles that we just spoke of. He is perfect in all of them, and therefore He is exalted as the only one through whom we have hope. But at the same time, He's our example in how we can be His workmen, in how we can be His hands and we can be His feet in accomplishing all of these purposes in our world today. And as we go through and look at those in more depth over the next couple of months, we really need to understand that we have that role in being His hands and His feet to ensure that He accomplishes all of these things in as many people's lives as He can. That responsibility has now been delegated to us to point people to Him so that He can serve them as their door, as their bread, as their shepherd, as their light in all of those areas. Folks, we've got to be those things in as much as we can to people to point them to that preeminent one who embodies them all. Now, I am, that's a definitive statement, isn't it? When Jesus says, I am whatever it was, there wasn't any room for error, was there? No room for inadequacy, no room for improvement. And when Jesus said, I am, He was saying so much more than sometimes we attribute to that. Thanks be to God that Jesus was willing to give up that glorified state, at least temporarily, give up that glorified state in heaven, come to this earth and put on flesh to live among men, to suffer in ways unimaginable, so that He could be all of these things to us and be our Savior and Messiah so that we could have hope. But do you have hope through Him tonight? If not, folks, He's still there. He's still available. His blood is still flowing freely, and He wants you to come. If you need to become a child of God, do that tonight in faith, penitence, confession, immersion. Just come and do what He's asked you to do. Be who He wants you to be. And He'll do for you more than you could possibly imagine. If you're a child of God and you need to come back, penitence, confession, prayer, the blood of His Son continues to flow freely. He'll cleanse you from all of your unrighteousness. He is the one, and there is no other. And so if you have need, come to Him tonight, while together we stand and sing.